Now, Scottish ministers have been urged to think about how new laws to soften the significant impact of planned changes to the UK benefit system will work out. In a report to the Welfare Reform Bill, Holyrood's Health Committee is warning that the changes could mean cuts in the payments to the most vulnerable.
David Nicholl is anxious about change. He suffers from cerebral palsy and his disability living allowance is set to be replaced by a new personal independence payment. He's concerned he might lose out because of plans to introduce new medical tests.
I'm worried by the 2013 assessments, mainly because I don't know what the assessments are going to be based on. If you don't know something, and you assume something, then that's what we're actually knowing.
With disability living allowance set to be cut by 20%, Capability Scotland are predicting that most disabled people will lose out.
Only those with the most severe needs will see any sort of increase. But I think it's also the additional fact of the way that disabled people will be hit by those passported benefits, the fact that they may lose a blue badge, the fact that they may not be able to get a mobility car anymore. These mean significant changes in disabled people's lives.
The Welfare Reform Bill is Westminster legislation, but parts of the bill relate to devolved issues. MSPs will be required to vote to allow legislation on welfare reform for the whole of the UK under a legislative consent motion. If MSPs back the Health and Sport Committee and do not pass the motion, this means new Scottish legislation.
Now, we have repeatedly bid for the Work and Pension Secretary Ian Duncan-Smith over the last month, but he has been unavailable every time. But we are delighted to have with us this afternoon Labour's Health spokesperson Jackie Baillie, the Deputy Convener of the Health and Sport Committee, the SNP's Bob Doris, and for the Conservatives, their Deputy Leader and Health spokesperson Jackson Carlow. Thank you all for coming in. Bob, first of all, do you expect that the government will vote against the LCM when it comes up?
I suspect that the Scottish Government will do that. Now, they won't take a decision on that, I understand, until next week. They'll be reviewing the report of the Health and Sport Committee. But the key thing here is that the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament, our Health Committee, want to distance ourselves from the most damaging aspects of these UK welfare reforms, and to vote down the LCM is the mechanism in which to do that. Yeah. But we have to be sure we get the issue of passported benefits correct, should we choose to do that. And that's what the Scottish Government's currently assessing. Yeah,
this is what Citizens Advice are so concerned about. We can talk about that in more detail, but just very briefly, if you do that, do you have time in the legislative programme to get something else in place?
Absolutely. The mechanism would be fairly technical, but yeah, we believe it can be done, and ideally it will be done. I think it's important that we stand beside disabled people in Scotland, single parents, those in social housing that are under Conservative attack right now. To take £2.5 billion of benefits off of these people is unacceptable, and voting down this LCM is a way to stand beside them and distance ourselves from these damaging UK reforms.
Well, Jackie, voting down an LCM has never been done before. Where does Labour stand on it?
Well, it was Labour that actually introduced the amendment to the parliamentary debate suggesting that we follow this course of action because, you know, it is the case that these are the most damaging changes to the welfare state, certainly in my lifetime, and they are having a disproportionate impact on people in Scotland. When I consider the disabled, those affected by council tax benefit changes, right the way across the board, Bob was right to highlight that it's going to mean a 2.5 million cut in the income of Scots moving ahead over the next few years. But, you know, beyond that, people are already estimating in independent reports that the level of child poverty will increase substantially. So yes, it is about saying to the UK government, we dislike the content of your welfare reform bill, but it's equally about saying to the Scottish government, there are going to be benefits now devolved to you. You have responsibility for telling us how they should best be employed in Scotland to protect the interests of people who are most disadvantaged in our communities.
But we know, Jackie, first of all, from Citizens Advice, that key benefits that you've mentioned, if there is a delay, if you vote down the LCM, then there's a delay in the bill going through Westminster. Citizens Advice are saying they're looking at benefits like income support, job seekers allowance, pension credit, council tax, and housing benefits, and they're very concerned that that in practice will mean delays in the most vulnerable people getting these benefits. I mean, that's a risk you're running, isn't it?
There is no need for delay. My understanding is both governments understand what potentially could happen here and have prepared for those eventualities. We certainly wouldn't want to delay benefits, but actually the UK government is operating an extremely tight timetable to say that all these changes need to be in by April 2013. We think that, you know, they should extend that timetable certainly so that things are worked through properly, but equally the Scottish Government is already thinking about what they should do. I had hoped they would do so earlier. I had hoped that in certain areas where they are going to have responsibility in the future, like community care grants, crisis loans, that we would have some answers about the principles of how they would operate. And I have to say, I find it quite strange that a party that wants to control the welfare state actually isn't telling us the detail of what they would do.
Well, but you can respond to that in a moment. But Jackson, your attitude to the LCM, the Conservatives' attitude?
Well, the whole purpose for the LCM is that the Westminster Government is trying to make the Scottish Government, Scotland, able to facilitate the legislation with the greatest ease. There's no particular advantage to Westminster in whether or not the LCM is passed or not. If we don't pass the LCM, and it would be the first time since devolution that we had failed to do so, then it simply places a further obligation upon the Scottish Government to come forward with primary legislation of its own. And I think there is a question mark over whether or not the timing of all of that can be expedited, or whether or not it will lead to the delays that some people fear. So it doesn't change fundamentally the legislation, and the legislation is needed. I mean, back in 1997, Frank Field, the Labour MP, was advocating welfare reform. It's all very well for Jackie to say we're being precipitous now, but we have waited 13 years for a Labour government to get to grips with this. The public, I think, understand that this is an area that needs to be reformed. These reforms are designed to give people dignity by moving them out of benefit and back into work. And yes, there are consequences, but I think to frustrate the LCM is simply giving more work to the Scottish Parliament. I think it's gesture politics, and I don't think it will improve the scrutability, and it won't, the scrutiny, and I don't think it will change fundamentally the legislation.
Well, let's look at something else that has been criticised as gesture politics. You want a committee set up to review the impact of the welfare reform bill. So if you respond to what Jackie was saying about not having details of the programme and why you think that committee is necessary, because that's divisive as well, isn't it? OK,
first things first, it's not just the SNP that are saying they want a committee set up. 3 committees of the Scottish Parliament have looked at this, and all 3 committees have agreed that a new committee, a Welfare and Benefits Committee, should be set up. The Labour members on the other 2 committees also agreed with that. It's only when we got to the lead committee, the Health Committee, that the Labour members decided to dissent from that. It's vital that this committee is set up. Scotland's third sector wants it set up. They want it set up for 2 reasons. Firstly, they want to scrutinise and analyse the impact of these UK reforms, but secondly, they want to make sure that it also scrutinises the Scottish Government's approach to mitigating this.
I have to say, we had 3 committees doing it. The recommendation is now to have 1. I am just genuinely disappointed that we've had more of a debate about form rather than function. And actually,
no, but there is a logic, isn't it? You were talking about monitoring what the UK government was doing. It would be an effective tool for monitoring what the UK government was doing, surely, if you had a committee in Scotland that was able to say this is a specifically Scottish effect, or a potential Scottish effect, perhaps more importantly.
But we have 3 committees currently charged with that responsibility rather than just 1. It will impact on more members of the Scottish Parliament and their consciousness. But also importantly, I think we have broken the link between health and poverty and welfare reform, which is disappointing. And if you set up a separate committee, that is indeed what happens. But again, I'm much more interested in actually what we're talking about rather than the committee that scrutinises it.
Jason Carlo, do you support the committee idea?
No, I'm inclined to agree with Jackie Baillie on this point. I mean, I don't for a moment think that it matters which committee looks at it. It won't, I think, be any more well-disposed towards the Conservative government at Westminster and what it's doing. I think we have a committee system in Scotland.
But should that be your main concern
it's
here?
Not,
I mean, if a committee is set up which protects the most vulnerable in Scotland, should you worry about how it interacts with the Westminster government?
My point is that by saying I don't want a new committee, it's not going to make the position of the Conservative government at Westminster any more comfortable. I actually believe that the current committee system, and as Jackie says, the Health Committee, where there is a link between health and poverty and all of these issues, is the right way forward. And I think to argue that, in fact, we need another Committee almost undermines the report that we've just published. It suggests that we weren't effective enough in the job that we did, and I don't believe that's the case.
But you effectively dilute the effectiveness of the committees.
Clearly not. We have to make sure there's consolidated scrutiny of these UK welfare impacts as it impacts upon Scotland. Currently, that is fragmented between 3 committees, and we're suggesting one committee with consolidated scrutiny across the board about all these negative effects. But I do agree with one thing with Jackie Baillie. OK, we disagree on whether the committee should be established. I think it would be a good thing. But the real issue here are these UK Tory cuts coming to Scotland. We have to mitigate the worst effects of these where we can. And on that basis, myself and Jackie Baillie will agree, and we have to make sure the Scottish Government is up to the task, and I believe we are.
Right. A note of consent. Well, 2 out of 3 ain't bad, as the song says. On that consent, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much.